Hello fellow game makers and welcome to part 2 of the Ribbon project. In this second part we are talking about the basics of textures in GameMaker and how you can apply textures to the custom geometry that you've created in part 1 of this series. Now, textures you may associate with 3D gaming or with 3D modeling, where you apply a surface to a model. But since modern 2D game engine use similar technology to render the graphics to the screen, you can actually also apply textures to 2D geometry in GameMaker. For example, here I took a water texture, a sprite, and applied it to the ribbon geometry that we've created in part 1. But before we do that, let's talk about a couple of basics. For example, where do the textures actually come from in GameMaker? Well, there are 3 possible sources. You can have sprites as textures, you can have backgrounds and surfaces. For the surface and the background, you only need to supply the ID of the resource. For the sprite, you need to supply the ID and the subimage you want to use. And that also brings us to the different purposes that these 3 different sources have. You use sprites as textures if you want an animating texture. You use backgrounds if you want static textures that do not change. And you can use surfaces as textures if you want dynamic textures with content created at runtime. I'm not going to go into detail about surfaces in this tutorial, but you may know that surfaces can be modified at runtime. You can create content for them, and as soon as they are finalized, you can actually use them as a texture and apply them to geometry. Now let's use this very simplistic checkerboard texture to tell you a little bit more about one of the more awkward aspects of textures, and that's texture coordinates. Every top left corner of a texture in GameMaker lies at the coordinates u equals 0 and v equals 0. Well, what happened to our beloved x and y coordinates? Well, they are reserved for geometry definitions, x, y, and z. So people started using u, v, and w when they talk about texture coordinates, and we only need u and v. So the u-axis would be what the x-axis is for geometry, it's the horizontal axis, and the v-axis would be what the y-axis is for geometry, so the vertical axis. And now comes the thing that you have to wrap your head around. The bottom right-hand corner of every texture is defined as u equals 1 and v equals 1. So if this is a texture that has a size of, let's say, 128 by 128 pixels, the bottom right-hand corner is not at 128, but it's at 1. And it's always at 1, whatever the size of the texture. So for example, if we have a texture that's 128 pixels wide and 64 pixels high, the bottom right-hand corner is still defined as u equals 1 and v equals 1. That means when we work with coordinates somewhere in the middle of the texture, we need values between 0 and 1. For example, the point at the exact middle of the texture is at u and v 0.5. Now you can see the advantage of that. It means that whatever the size, you always get the middle point of a texture when you supply u and v coordinates equal 0.5. So whether the texture is 1000 pixels wide or 500, if you want the middle point, you only need to supply those values and you will always get it. The downside is that you have to now think in relative values between 0 and 1 and not in absolute pixel values. Now I've told you that the range for textures lies between 0 and 1 on the u-axis and on the v-axis. But what if you access a point like, let's say, u equals 2 and v equals 0? If you don't do anything about it, GameMaker does not know what the texture at that point is, because the range only runs from 0.1. So what it will do is it will take the last known texture information, which would be here, and stretch it all the way to the coordinate that you've asked for, and you will get this stretched artifact, and we'll see that later on. However, there is a flag in GameMaker that you can set. It's called texture set repeat, and if you set that to true, GameMaker will now actually start tiling the textures up to the coordinates that you've asked for. So at every whole number, 1, 2, 3, it will start a new repetition of the texture. Let's have a look at the code modifications that you need if you want to create textured geometry. Everything can stay the same, you just need to amend a couple of things. For example, you now need to call draw primitive begin texture, and you don't only have to tell it how you want to define the geometry, but also you have to supply a texture ID that you want to use and apply to the surface. And the draw vertex changes to draw vertex texture, because now for every corner point you don't only have to supply the x and y coordinates, but you also have to supply the texture coordinates. What part of the texture should be drawn at this corner point? And GameMaker will then try and interpolate, meaning fill in the intermediate values between the corner points and fill the surface with the complete texture. And where do you get the texture ID from? Well, for example, by calling Sprite getTexture if you want a texture as a sprite. So let's have a look at what that means for our ribbon project. Again, we're just going to talk about the very beginning of the path, because if you understand how to texture the first couple of segments, you will understand how to do the rest. So let's zoom in here, and here we have the first two segments of the path, and that's the texture that we want to apply to it. What I want to do is I want to take this texture and squeeze it into this first segment like so that it really fills the first segment, and then do the same again for the second segment, and so on. So you now have to think about all of those corner points here and what texture coordinates they actually have. Let's start with the points that lie on this top part of the ribbon here, because you will realize that they all come from the top edge of our texture, and that top edge is always at v equals 0. So we already know the v coordinate for all of those points. Similarly, all the points that lie at the bottom of our ribbon also come from the bottom of our texture, so their v coordinates are always 1. That means we already know all the v coordinates we need to know. But what about the u coordinates? Let's start with the 2 points at the very beginning of the path. Well, we know that they come from the left edge of the texture, so their u coordinates must be 0. Here at the end of the first segment, they come from the right side of the texture, which is u equals 1. And now if we set the repetition of the textures to true, we can actually use for the second segment a u value of 2, which lies somewhere here, but GameMaker will fill it in with a repetition of the texture. And that means it's very simple in this case to apply the texture. While we run through the path, we just increase the u value per segment 0, 1, 2, 3, and we'll get one perfect repetition of the texture for each segment. Now let's see what that looks like in GameMaker. We'll start with the project exactly where we've left off at the end of part 1 with our untextured ribbon geometry. Let's now create a texture for that by first creating a sprite. And I'll actually go for the checkerboard texture that we've also used in the theory part at the beginning. Something like that. Now it's important to tick this checkbox here, used for 3D, and that requires that the texture is a power of 2. So for example 32 by 32 or 32 by 64 or 128 by 256. Why do we need to check that? It's a bit difficult to explain, but usually GameMaker crams all the sprites and graphics and backgrounds that you have onto so-called texture pages. And these texture pages are then parsed by GameMaker internally to draw the different parts, the different sprites on the screen where you want them. The problem is that, as we've said before, texture coordinates are defined in a range from 0 to 1, no matter the size of the source texture. So if you have a texture page that is 2048 pixels wide and 2048 pixels high, crammed full with sprites, you would first have to figure out at which u and v coordinates does this sprite actually lie at. It could be at 0.001 or something like that. Now you can do that, and it actually can help increase the speed and efficiency of the drawing. But for this basic tutorial, we'll just use the checkbox here, because what it does is it forces this sprite to be on its own texture page. And that means that we can be absolutely certain that the left edge is at coordinates 0 and the right edge is at texture coordinates 1, and the same for the top and bottom edge. Let's now change the code for the ribbon object. First, in the create event, we need to add one more variable which holds our texture, and we want to get that from a sprite. Add subimage 0. And let's now modify the draw event. In the draw event, we first need to change the draw primitive begin to draw primitive begin texture to tell it that we want to draw textured geometry. And now, as you can see, it expects us to supply the kind of geometry and the texture ID. So in addition to that, we also need our texture variable. The only other thing you need to change in this code is wherever we have draw vertex commands. Those need to be draw vertex texture. And as you can see down here, it now not only expects the x and y coordinates, but also the x and y texture coordinates, which we know as u and v coordinates. So let's think about that for those first 2 points. This is the point at the top of the ribbon at the very beginning of the path. This is the point at the bottom of the ribbon at the beginning of the path. So we already know the v coordinates. Let's actually do it like this. And the v coordinates are at the top, we are at v equals 0, and at the bottom, we are at v equals 1. But what about the x coordinate, so to say, the u coordinate? Well, we are at the very beginning of the path, so we know that we are at the u position 0, at the left edge of the texture. Now let's say for now we want to take one texture, one repetition of the texture, and stretch it all along the path, no matter how long it is. That means that at the end of the path, we should have the u coordinate 1. And as you can see, this perfectly correlates to what I does in this for loop. It starts at 0 at the beginning of the path and then counts all the way up to 1. So if we just use the value I here, we will get the perfect intermediate u coordinates along the path from 0 to 1. Let's change that for the other instances of draw vertex. And there are 2 more. And 1. And that's it. You don't need to change anything else, just the draw vertex and the draw primitive begin texture. However, if we test our game now, we will see that something's wrong. We would expect our texture to be drawn now, but still all we see is black. For whatever reason, when drawing textures, GameMaker tints these textures with the current drawing color. The default drawing color in GameMaker is black. So what we need to do is we need to change the drawing color here to draw set color white. And white draws the texture without any tinting, and we should now see our texture. As you can see, there is one repetition of the texture stretched all along the path, and here it's kind of blurry, well, because we stretched the texture, so it tries to interpolate the colors here. If you don't want that, if you want a crisp texture, even though it's stretched, you can very well do that. We just need to add one more line here, and that line is texture set interpolation to false. So now GameMaker will not try and find the intermediate colors for us. We'll switch that back on after we are done drawing. And the result, as you will see, is that the texture is now crisp, even though it is stretched. Now let's have a look at what we need to modify if we want 2 repetitions of the texture along the path. Let's go back to our drawing code, and what we need to change is this u value here. If we want 2 repetitions, we need to change the u coordinates at the intermediate points along the path. And again, think about it from the beginning and the end. The beginning is still 0, u equals 0. But what about the end point? If we want 2 repetitions, we need to be at the u coordinates 2 at the end of the path. So we know that I counts all the way up to 1, so if we just multiply that by 2, all the u values should now match, and we have 2 repetitions of the texture. Let's see. So you can see that the texture seems to be smaller now, but somehow the second repetition hasn't worked. And that's exactly what I told you before. Right now, GameMaker doesn't know what to do with texture coordinates above 1. We first have to set the flag texture set repeat to true, and again we can switch that off after we're done drawing. And now we should see the 2 repetitions correctly. There it is, 2 repetitions along the path. You will already have realized that that is very unflexible. If we always have to go in here and change this value if we want to change the number of texture repeats. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to replace that with a variable. Let's call that texture repeats. We'll just multiply it with this texture repeats variable. And then in the create event, we can actually just define that as, let's say, 10. And let's have a look. We should now have 10 repetitions along the path. There you have it. There is still some stretching going on right now, but it's not really easy to see because of this square texture. So I want to show this to you using a round texture. And for that, let's just create a circle in the sprite editor. Don't forget to check use for 3D so that it gets placed on its own texture page. Now we need to change the width of the path to 32 because that's the height of our sprite. And let's leave the texture repeats at 10 right now and change the sprite to the sprite bubble. And you will see that there is some quite severe stretching going on. What if we want no stretching at all? What if we want the perfect round texture being repeated along the path? Well, we'll need to do a little bit of math. If we knew how long this path actually is in pixels, and we know that our sprite is 32 pixels wide, if we divide the path length by 32, we will actually get the number of repetitions, even if it's a floating point number, that perfectly fits the path. Let's actually do that. Let's change this from 10 to path get length divided by 32, and you can now see that no stretching is going on at all. However, that means that this last texture here is cut off. Well, that's clear. If we don't want any stretching, it can happen that the last repetition just doesn't fit completely. What if we want the best of both worlds? We want to have as little stretching as possible, but still we want to have a perfect end for our texture. We need to use a different operator, not divided by, but diff. What diff does is it takes a value and it checks how often does that value fit into a larger value without any remainder. So as an example, if we do 100 diff 25, it will look how often does 25 fit into 100 without any remainder, and the answer is 4. So 100 diff 25 would be 4. If you do 101 diff 25, it will also equal 4, because 25 only fits 4 times into 101 without a remainder. And that means that this operation here, the length of the path diff the sprite width, which in this case is 32, will give us the number of whole repetitions that the sprite fits into the path without any remainder. Let's have a look at the effect of that. And now you can see there is no noticeable stretching, and the texture ends without any cut off parts. Finally, for the end of this part, let me show you that this also works with open path. Okay guys, that's it. Those are the basics for textures and applying textures to custom geometry in GameMaker. In the third and last part of the ribbon project, we are now going to have a look at some concrete examples about how you can use this in your games. We are going to have a look at how to animate the texture and change the path points and make this all dynamic and fun. See you then.